25th of March, 1941. A converted mansion set amongst the rolling countryside of Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire lies quiet in the early morning darkness. Inside, in one of the prefabricated huts scattered across the estate, a group of brilliant young mathematicians, linguists, and chess champions are working in near silence. The only sounds are the distant hum of machinery, the shuffle of papers, and the occasional murmur of urgent conversation. They are not soldiers, and they have never fired a weapon. Yet in this moment, in this unremarkable building in the English Midlands, they are fighting a war that determines the fate of nations. Above them, somewhere over occupied Europe, German aircraft are receiving orders that will never reach their destination. Across the Atlantic, German U-boats are turning away from merchant convoys they believe will never find them. In North Africa, German commanders are moving their armies to intercept British forces that have somehow predicted their every movement. The secret is not superhuman intelligence, nor is it luck. The secret is a machine that the Germans believed was mathematically impossible to break. For nearly 1,000 days, whilst the Nazis slept, the British had been reading their most closely guarded secrets. This is the story of how that became possible. This is the story of the bomb. During the early years of the Second World War, Nazi Germany possessed what it believed to be an unbreakable cipher, the Enigma machine, a sophisticated electromechanical device that looked rather like a typewriter crossed with a telephone switchboard, had been in use by German military forces since the late 1920s. Every German officer, from the highest levels of command in Berlin down to individual U-boat captains patrolling the Atlantic, used this machine to encode their most sensitive communications. The Germans were utterly confident in its security. In fact, they were so convinced of its impregnability that they discussed this confidence in their own encrypted messages. Officers would refer to Enigma as a system so secure that no enemy, however clever or well-resourced, could possibly break it. This conviction was not born from ignorance. Mathematicians within the German armed forces had studied the machine's mechanics and concluded quite reasonably that the number of possible configurations was so vast as to render brute force decryption impossible. They were, by the standards of 1930s mathematics, almost correct. Yet they had made one critical assumption, that the enemy would have to work with the resources available in the normal world. They did not account for the possibility that the British would construct something unprecedented. They did not imagine that British engineers would build a machine capable of testing thousands of configurations every single minute, tirelessly, relentlessly, day after day, and night after night. The intelligence failure was not one of mathematics, but of imagination. The problem facing the Allies in 1940 and 1941 was genuinely stark. German communications were encrypted by Enigma machines deployed across the entire Wehrmacht, the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Without access to these messages, the British were flying blind. They knew the enemy was somewhere out there, but not where, and not what he intended. In the Atlantic, the Battle of the Atlantic was turning decidedly in Germany's favor. German U-boats, coordinated through encrypted wireless communications, were sinking merchant ships at a rate that threatened to strangle Britain's supply lines. In the months before the cryptanalytic breakthrough, German submarines sank over 500,000 tons of shipping. At this rate of loss, some British strategists calculated that the nation would be forced to surrender within 2 years. The mathematics were brutal. Every day without these supplies meant fewer weapons manufactured, fewer soldiers fed, less hope of eventual victory. In North Africa, German and Italian forces under Erwin Rommel were advancing seemingly unopposed. Without knowledge of his plans, his supply routes, and his intentions, British commanders were essentially gambling when they ordered their own attacks. In the air, the Luftwaffe maintained a strategic advantage. German bombers struck at targets they had chosen, and British fighter squadrons often responded too late, scrambling to intercept formations that had already dropped their loads. The gap between having this intelligence and not having it could mean the difference between an airfield being bombed and an airfield being saved, between dozens of fighter aircraft being destroyed on the ground and those same aircraft being in the air, ready for combat, beyond even these military considerations lay a deeper, more existential problem. The Germans were developing plans of staggering ambition and terrifying scope. Britain's military and political leadership needed to know what those plans were. They needed to know because Britain in 1940 and into 1941 was fighting almost entirely alone. The United States had not yet entered the war. The Soviet Union and Germany were still bound by a non-aggression pact. Britain could not afford to be surprised. Surprise could mean defeat. Before 1940, a small group of Polish mathematicians and engineers had achieved something remarkable. They had partially penetrated the Enigma system, recovering some of its secrets through a combination of mathematics, industrial espionage, and sheer ingenuity. However, as the Germans introduced new refinements to their Enigma machines, additional rotor configurations, changes to the wiring, new electrical connections, the Polish solution became obsolete. By the time war came to Poland, the nation's cryptanalysts made a decision of extraordinary prescience. They copied all their research, all their progress, all their understanding of the Enigma machine's vulnerabilities, and they gave it to the British. Two Polish mathematicians, Marian Rejewski and Henryk Zygalski, traveled to Paris and then to Britain, bringing with them the accumulated knowledge of years of work. This gift would prove invaluable, but it would not be sufficient. The challenge that faced the British codebreakers was one of almost incomprehensible complexity. An Enigma machine of the period contained 3 rotating drums, known as rotors, each of which could be set in any of 26 positions. This meant there were 17,576 possible rotor combinations, but the Enigma was more sophisticated than that. Before the message even encountered the rotors, it passed through a plug board at the front of the machine. This plug board allowed operators to rewire connections between letters, and there were 1 quintillion possible configurations of just this component. Add to this the fact that the rotor's initial positions changed daily, and that the Germans were constantly changing the internal wiring of the machines themselves, and the complexity became dizzying. To test every possible configuration manually would have been a task requiring centuries of continuous work. However, a young British mathematician named Alan Turing realized something crucial. The machine did not have to be broken by human intelligence alone. The solution was to build another machine, a machine that could search through configurations at mechanical speed. The engineering challenge fell to a group of brilliant minds working at the British Tabulating Machine Company's facility in Dollis Hill, North London, and later at Bletchley Park itself. The most famous of these engineers was Gordon Welchley, though the work was truly collaborative, drawing on the skills of mathematicians, logicians, electrical engineers, and telecommunications specialists. What they built was called the bomb, a name that echoed back to an earlier Polish machine with a similar purpose. The bomb was a towering mass of electrical circuits, rotating drums, and cabling. It measured roughly 2.1 meters tall, 2.4 meters long, and 1 meter deep. Imagine 3 large office refrigerators standing together. Inside, it contained hundreds of electrical relays, devices that worked rather like rapid-fire light switches, and dozens of rotating drums identical in principle to those found in an Enigma machine itself. When operational, the bomb made a sound described by those who worked nearby as resembling a mechanical dragon, a rhythmic clicking, whirring, and humming that was audible throughout the hut. At its peak operation, a single bomb machine tested configurations at a rate of approximately 10,000 per hour. This meant that a problem which would take a human cryptanalyst months to solve manually could be resolved by the machine in minutes. The principle behind the bomb's operation was elegant. It did not attempt to test every possible configuration of every possible component. Instead, it worked from the probable. The codebreakers at Bletchley had developed sophisticated techniques for identifying patterns in German messages, for guessing probable phrases that might appear in encrypted traffic, a weather report beginning with wetter, for instance, or a daily situation report beginning with betrachtungen. Once they had identified a probable phrase, or what they called a crib, they could feed this information into the bomb. The machine would then systematically test configurations, checking whether the assumption that this phrase appeared at this location in the message was consistent with the Enigma settings of the day. When it found a configuration that worked, electrical contacts would close and a mechanical bell would sound. A technician would remove the printed results, verify them by hand using an actual Enigma machine, and if correct, the key for the day would be passed to the translation teams.
The work of building these machines was conducted under extraordinary secrecy. Most people working on the bomb program had no understanding of its purpose or how it contributed to the broader war effort. It was, by definition, a machine for breaking codes, but exactly which codes, how they were broken, and to what effect remained compartmentalized information. The British government ensured that the complete picture was known only to a very few individuals. As a result, the engineering teams worked knowing only that their machine was needed urgently and that its operation would somehow contribute to British victory. They worked with typical British understatement, never quite acknowledging to one another the extraordinary nature of what they were accomplishing. The first breakthrough came in the early months of 1940. Messages encrypted using the Luftwaffe's Enigma networks began to yield their secrets. This was significant but limited. The Luftwaffe, as the German Air Force, operated with protocols that differed from those of the Army and Navy, and the intelligence gleaned was sometimes tactical in nature. Information about bomber formations, airfield locations, fuel reserves. Within a few weeks, however, the codebreakers made a far more consequential breakthrough. They achieved, against all odds, what the Germans believed impossible. They began to read U-boat communications. The German Navy's Enigma variant, known as Kriegsmarine Enigma, was encrypted with greater sophistication than the Luftwaffe's version. It incorporated an additional rotor and used different daily key procedures. Breaking it required not just the bomb, but also stolen information. In May 1941, a British minesweeper captured an intact Enigma machine and codebooks from the German U-110 sunk in the North Atlantic. This intelligence, combined with the bomb's mechanical searching, allowed the British to begin reading U-boat messages with relative regularity. If you are finding this information interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The work being done at Bletchley Park was among the most important intelligence operations of the Second World War, and the full story has only emerged in recent decades. The impact of Bombay decryption on the Battle of the Atlantic was almost immediate. Knowing the positions of U-boat wolf packs, their intended targets, and their anticipated movements allowed British and later American convoys to be routed away from danger. Instead of accepting that a U-boat might sink a substantial portion of any convoy, British naval commanders could now make informed decisions about routing and protection. In one celebrated example, convoy ONS-5, which had suffered grievously in previous months, successfully traversed the Atlantic in May 1943 with minimal losses, having been routed based upon current Enigma intelligence. The German Navy had no idea that their unbreakable cipher was yielding daily secrets. They continued to place absolute confidence in Enigma's security, never realizing that the British had not simply guessed the key but had built a machine capable of finding it. Compared to German cryptanalytic efforts, the British achievement was significantly more sophisticated. The Germans possessed their own signals intelligence operation, known as the B-Dienst, which successfully broke some British naval cipher systems, but they never achieved anything close to the systematic industrialized approach of Bletchley Park. The Germans constructed some mechanical code-breaking devices, but these were far less advanced and less reliable than the bomb. The American approach, once the United States entered the war, was different again. American signals intelligence services developed sophisticated systems for breaking Japanese ciphers, most notably the JN-25 naval code. However, the American effort, like the British effort, was fundamentally a race between two forms of cryptanalysis: German against British, American against Japanese. The British innovation lay not in doing something Germans thought impossible, but in building a machine that made the impossible routine. When captured German documents were analyzed after the war, they revealed something remarkable. German military and intelligence leadership had debated whether their Enigma system might be vulnerable to enemy cryptanalysis. Some senior officers raised concerns, arguing that the theoretical mathematics suggested potential weaknesses. These concerns were invariably dismissed. The consensus, endorsed by the highest levels of Nazi leadership, was that Enigma was secure. This confidence, though born from reasonable mathematical reasoning, proved catastrophic. It meant that Germany continued to use Enigma for the most sensitive communications, never suspecting that every message was being intercepted and decoded. The impact on German military operations was profound. In North Africa, British commanders possessing current intelligence on Rommel's movements and supply situation repeatedly outmaneuvered him, not through superior tactics alone, but through superior information. When German forces attempted offensives, they often found British troops already prepared and positioned. When German commanders thought they were attacking at an unexpected location, the British were waiting. The Luftwaffe's bombing campaign against Britain continued throughout 1940 and into 1941, was partially countered through Enigma intelligence that allowed fighter units to be concentrated against expected attack routes. Historians have estimated that ultra-intelligence, the designation given to intelligence derived from Enigma decryption, shortened the war in Europe by an estimated 2 to 4 years. Put another way, the bomb machines operating in those Bletchley Park huts tested countless configurations every single day, and in doing so prevented millions of deaths. The legacy of Bletchley Park and the bomb extended far beyond the Second World War. The fundamental principles of machine computation that the British had developed while breaking Enigma represented, in many respects, the first large-scale automated information processing system ever constructed. The machines were not computers in the modern sense. They performed a single task with extraordinary efficiency but lacked the flexibility and general-purpose computing capabilities of true computers. Yet they demonstrated something crucial: that machines could be designed to solve previously intractable problems. The engineers who worked on the bomb program, many of them young men at the outset of war, went on to pioneer early computing development in the post-war period. Some worked on Colossus, an experimental programmable computing machine built specifically to break a different German cipher. Others brought the experience and expertise gained at Bletchley Park into the emerging computer industry. The logic that had been applied to cryptanalysis could be applied to any problem amenable to systematic logical analysis. In the immediate years after 1945, all of this remained secret. The existence of Bletchley Park itself was not publicly acknowledged until decades later. The bomb machines were dismantled or destroyed. Some were melted down for scrap metal. Fewer than 10 authentic bomb machines survived the post-war period. For decades, the full contribution of cryptanalysis to British and Allied victory remained unknown. When the Official Secrets Act finally relaxed enough to allow partial disclosure in the 1970s, and fuller revelation came in subsequent decades, the British public learned that they had possessed a secret weapon every bit as significant, if not more significant, than any military invention. Today, a fully functional replica Bombay machine stands in the National Museum of Computing at Bletchley Park. Visitors can see the device in operation, watch it test configurations, and hear that distinctive mechanical sound that once filled the wartime huts. The original machine, or what remains of it, is preserved as an artifact of extraordinary historical importance. Return then to March 25, 1941. Somewhere in the darkness above occupied Europe, a German bomber is receiving an encrypted radio transmission from its base. The aircraft's radio operator, trained to use Enigma, receives the message in German, clear and unambiguous. He passes it to the pilot. The target is specified, the approach route detailed, the expected opposition described. The message is absolutely secure, the operator knows. The Enigma machine guarantees this security. What neither the operator nor the pilot nor the commanders who sent that order realized was that the message had already been read. 7 hours earlier, before dawn at Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire, a bomber machine had found the day's key. The message had been decrypted, translated, and analyzed. The target had been identified. The expected time of arrival had been calculated. British fighter squadrons were already being positioned, already climbing into the night sky, already vectoring towards the interception point. When that German bomber arrived over its target, it did not find the assembly line or the aircraft factory or the radar station it sought. It found instead a darkness filled with British fighters. The innovation that made this possible was not born from genius. It was born from the marriage of theoretical mathematics and mechanical engineering. It was born from the necessity of war and the determination of people who refused to accept that the enemy's secrets were truly secret. It was the bomb machine, and it was perhaps the most important weapon in Britain's arsenal.